In this nugget, I want to walk you through a troubleshooting scenario regarding admission control settings at the cluster. Let's begin. For this troubleshooting scenario, we are logged onto the vSphere web client as administrator at vSphere.local. And here's the scenario that we've been given. When these VMs, VM-TC-01 all the way through 08, when they are brought up, not all of them are allowed to boot. So we want to do a few things. Number one, go in and verify that that's the case to recreate the symptoms so we can observe it. And then based on that failure, take a look at what the possibilities are, and then go ahead and implement changes to correct it. So with the cluster selected over here on the navigator panel on the left, and I do see a little icon indicating there's a problem. We'll get to that in a moment, but right now with the cluster-1 selected, let's go ahead and click on the VMs tab right here. And let's go ahead and power on these VMs. So I'm just going to grab VM-TC-01, hold down the Shift key, grab the last one, which is 8, so they're all highlighted. And then we'll go ahead and click on the power on icon right here for those VMs. Fantastic, and it appears none of them can run. So the message here says insufficient resources to satisfy a configured failover level for vSphere HA for high availability. So let's see if just a few of them by themselves will come up. Let's click on OK. And let's go ahead and just bring up maybe half of them. So let's select the row for VMTC-01, and let's hold down the Shift key and go through 4. So with those 4 highlighted, we'll go ahead and click on the Power On Selected Virtual Machines icon right here. And those seem to be starting no problem. If we go to Recent Tasks, sure enough, it's powering all those on. Alright, let's go ahead and do 5 and 6 by highlighting both of those and then clicking on Power On the Selected Virtual Machine. And those two appear to be coming up. Okay. And let's go ahead and do 7 and 8. So with VM 7 and 8 both selected, we'll go ahead and once more, we'll click on the Power On the Selected Virtual Machines. And it's pointing to the same message it did earlier. Insufficient resources to satisfy the configured failover level for vSphere HA. So if this is an HA issue, we probably ought to go take a look at the configuration as it's asking us regarding high availability. So we'll click on OK regarding the message. Let's also click on the Summary tab here for Cluster-1. That way we can see this message here. And here it says insufficient capacity in Cluster 1 to satisfy resource configuration in the Las Vegas data center, which also is very likely related to admission control as part of our cluster. So with the cluster on the left still selected, let's go ahead and click on Monitor. And with the Monitor tab selected, and then below that, clicking on vSphere HA, I'm going to go ahead and collapse this part here for host by clicking on the little down arrow to the left of hosts. And right here under Advanced Runtime Info, it's showing us the failover capacity for memory, which currently is about 70%. And the failover capacity for CPU, which is around 67%. And those numbers look fairly aggressive regarding wasting resources. So an administrator could have manually put in those percentages, or more likely, they changed the number of hosts that they're willing to tolerate to something higher than 1. So here's a little math exercise. If we are willing to only tolerate 1 host failure and we have 3 hosts, that's 1/3. So admission control is going to attempt to reserve about 33% of resources at any given time to tolerate that single host failure. Another example would be if we had only 2 hosts and we were willing to tolerate 1 failure, that ratio would be 50%. And as a result, if admission control is enabled, it's going to attempt to reserve that amount of resources so that if one of our hosts dies, all the VMs that were there can be restarted over on the still running ESXi host. And that's what this message here was complaining about at the cluster, saying, hey, I don't have enough resources to do what you want me to do. I don't have enough resources to have 70% of memory and about 67% of CPU if we bring up additional VMs. So the first VMs that we booted up were no problem, but once we started loading up the system with additional VMs, and that's what it stopped us because of this admission control percentage right here. So continuing on in our example, if we had 4 ESXi hosts and we were willing to tolerate 1, what would the resulting percentage be right here? And if you're saying, Keith, well, if we follow this logic, it would be 25%. And let's do one more. Let's imagine we had 5 hosts in our cluster. We want to be able to tolerate a single failure of a single host. What would then be the percentage? And if you said, Keith, that would be 20%, you'd be absolutely correct. So you see how these numbers here of 70 and 67%, we only have 3 ESXi hosts. So somebody has gone in and changed the default. Either they changed the number of hosts that we're willing to tolerate, or they manually put in those numbers. So let's go ahead and take a look and see what happened. To do that, let's go ahead and click on Configure, the Configure tab regarding Cluster-1. And under Services, if we click on vSphere Availability, and then down here with Admission Control, we can expand that. And here it's reflecting percentages that we saw on the previous screen. So let's click on the Edit button in the upper right-hand corner to go ahead and take a closer look at the settings for Admission Control. So that took us to Edit Cluster Settings and specifically to vSphere Availability. So this shows us that we have HA enabled. And as a subcomponent, we have Admission Control, giving us the grief about not being able to start additional VMs. And if we had a third-party solution that was keeping track of our hardware and could give vSphere heads up regarding problems with that hardware, we could use the feature of Proactive HA, so our vSphere environment could start evacuating VMs and moving them over to other hosts that are not having the same problem. So for these solutions to work, we need to have Distributed Resource Scheduler enabled on the cluster, and the option for that is right here regarding the vSphere DRS configuration. And we'd also want, as part of vSphere DRS, to have it set for fully automated. And of course, we'd also want vMotion installed and functioning and working so that the actual movement of VMs can take place. So if we go up to vSphere DRS just for a moment, so it's enabled, it's set to fully automated, that's great. Let's go back to vSphere Availability. So vSphere HA is on, and we also want to go down to Admission Control, because that's what the message that popped up indicated when we tried to power on a VM and it wouldn't let us. And right here, this solves the mystery. So it's currently set to tolerate 2 host failures, and it's using a percentage, and it automatically calculated that approximately 66%, which is being willing to tolerate 2 hosts failing out of our total 3. So to change this, we use the drop-down arrow, and go ahead and set that back to 1. And for our failover capacity, we're going to leave that as cluster resource percentage. And then we have a little message indicating, hey, these percentages will be updated after you save this, after it's been reconfigured. So let's click on OK. And check this out. Now, as our percentages are showing up here, they're showing up closer to the 33%. And if we went back to Edit, so we'll click Edit one more time in the upper right-hand corner. And we'll click on Admission Control one more time here on the left of the cluster settings. So now it's showing us right here what that percentage is. And if we wanted to, we could go ahead and override that calculated capacity. All right, so that looks better. So we'll click on OK. And now let's see if we can boot those VMs. So if we click on the VMs tab regarding the cluster, and VM7 and VM8 are still highlighted here. So we'll click on the icon to power on those selected virtual machines. And it appears they're coming up. We'll go to Recent Tasks. And that shows that the vCenter server has given the instructions to the respective ESXi host to start those VMs. So if we minimize recent tasks, we can see here visually from the icon that those 2 VMs are running, and it's also showing us here in this column regarding host which ESXi host they're being launched on. And the decision for that where to launch these VMs, of course, is done by vSphere DRS. In this nugget, we identified that certain VMs indeed would not boot up, they wouldn't start. We identified that the reason was pointing to admission control, and then we tweaked admission control to specify that we wanted to be able to tolerate 1 host failure in the cluster out of the 3 that we had. And with that change saved, we then attempted to boot the remaining 2 VMs, and they did indeed come up. So thank you for joining me in this walkthrough of the Troubleshooting Lab, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.